Hello, and welcome to the AI Engineering Podcast, your guide to the fast-moving world of building scalable and maintainable AI systems. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Jim Olsen about governance of your generative AI models and applications. So, Jim, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm the Chief Technology Officer of ModelOp, and that's exactly what we provide as a solution is a solution to cover the generative AI and the AI governance and regulations that's out there. I've been a software engineer for more years than I care to admit, so I've seen everything across the industry for a long time, and this is an exciting and new space.
And do you remember how you first got started working in the machine learning arena?
Yeah, actually, the very first thing I did with machine learning was back in the early 90s, like probably 1990. Actually, I have a degree in both computer science and psychology and was looking to blend the two back then even, which is why I did that. And I was building my own neural networks and things like that on a much more simplistic scale than we do today. But, we were doing a lot of like vision recognition kind of stuff and also trying to model human thought processes as part of the psychology degree and things like that as well. So it's kind of my early experiences of that. And then, of course, I've used aspects of it throughout the entire time since then.
And in the context of governance for the current generation of AI models, which typically means generative AI, so large language models, some of these vision models that are able to produce images and video, and obviously the field's expanding as we speak. I'm wondering if you can just start by giving a bit of an overview about what governance even means for those types of technologies.
Yeah, well, those are what we refer to as the foundational models. And all the foundational models, of course, can be used for many different things. So governance really pertains more to the use cases that you then do with the models rather than the individual model itself. Because it's very different if I'm like, generating a image for my blog. There shouldn't, in my opinion, there shouldn't be a whole lot of governance on that. You're reviewing it, it's in your hand, you can decide to use it or not. It's a tool then. I believe there should be less governance around in those spaces. But when it's doing something like, for instance, detecting cancer, summarizing a doctor's notes, if it inserted suddenly that, it admitted, let's say, for the fact that a doctor gave a very specific medication or something, and that didn't make it in the summary, and you couldn't have a double dose on that, that could have very serious consequences. And so those are the kinds of spaces where it's the use case of how you're using this that I think deserves more attention around where governance should apply or not, because it's the implications. What's the risk? And that's why we always talk about model risk.
We won't dig too much into this for this conversation, but I think it's also interesting to your point of the foundation models. The governance comes in after the point of they have already been created, at least for the use cases that most people are interacting with them for. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the governance or possibly lack thereof, or at least lack of transparency about the governance that is involved in the creation of those models and some of the data sets and the opacity of that overall process.
Yeah, I mean, that's one area that's definitely, we refer to these as vendor models. So that means myself as the person consuming that model do not have any insights into realistically how it was built. And, realistically, let's say you could view the entire data set of what went into ChatGPT 4 as an example. How much insight would that actually really give you? I mean, you could absolutely find, there are concerns around like GPDR, and does it have information in there that should have been pulled out? And, those are legal concerns. But frankly, those legal concerns more address the developer of the model itself than the consumer of the model, because, we haven't seen any cases yet where they try to go after somebody who just is using a vendor model who put some inappropriate data in there or something. We're not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to go after you on that. But then how you choose to use it and how you monitor it and what you do, just because you're using a vendor model doesn't mean you can't establish your own baselines and ongoing monitoring of how it's performing for your specific use case, and the review processes and other things to make sure you're compliant in how you use that model. I mean, that's where I'll talk a lot about use cases here, because that's really what's important if you look at most of the regulations, like the EU regulation that's come out recently. It's all around, specific kinds of use cases where they could affect people, like making legal judgments or healthcare decisions or those kinds of things. That's where the concerns come out.
Governance, in particular, as an overall practice, is generally categorized as a hybrid socio-technical endeavor where it requires the involvement of engineers and technical controls around the enforcement of the policies, but the actual policy creation is something that is largely managed at the business level and in the context of that regulatory environment. And I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the difficulties that organizations are facing in understanding what actually even needs to be included in those policies and the elements of generative AI that are in scope for those policies, and some of the ways that the understanding of the models is a requirement of that overall process.
Yeah, well, the overall kind of how you approach it is still evolving a lot. I mean, obviously the EU regulation it's one of the first big ones to really just come online. So most organizations are struggling to understand just even what they do, but even as further than that, even what they have. Because as I said, how many models are actually embedded in products you just consume? We see this a lot in the healthcare industry, for example. And the healthcare industry in the US is one of the first industries to really fall under a bunch of different state regulations. We don't have a real formal federal level regulation like the EU yet. We have some guidance and some policies, but not hardline requirements like the EU. That's not true when you get to the state level. So understanding, these evolving individual AI acts that affect places like Texas and Colorado and others, and having the clear understanding of what you have to do, and even finding the models is most organizations aren't prepared for that at all. And that's where, you do need a system like we develop to be able to, first and foremost, get a proper inventory of what the heck you're using, even to understand and where they're being used. Because that's great, you have Chat GPT-4, but what's it being used for? I've heard situations where people were using Chat GPT-4 in hospitals and actually sending patient information to it to get summaries back, and that's a big no-no. That's hitting all kinds of PII kind of issues and et cetera, and very sensitive information to be shipping that off-site like that. So it's understanding what do we need to control, what's there, what does a proper process look like, what are the steps involved in order to make sure I am compliant, and how do I do this? Many places are trying to build this stuff themselves, and we see lots of struggles with that, because again, you don't even understand what needs to be built. It's not like software where you have a straight CI/CD pipeline, well understood, do your unit tests, do your integration tests. It's very clear. When we start to get into testing models, especially when we talk about generative AI models, where they are inherently non-interpretable, you have to come up with different testing strategies, different things that are based on the use case and how you do that, and have proper steps in place to make sure you're compliant with all these regulations. And that's basically why we founded this company and why we started doing this, because this goes back before generative AI models, traditional ML models, in highly regulated industries like banks have been having to do this for a long time. Gen AI just adds in the new things that all of the models in banking are generally interpretable. They wouldn't put them out otherwise, whereas Gen AI use cases are not.
The mention of OpenAI in particular is interesting in this space as well, because, as you said, if you are interacting with GPT-4 or any of their other models, you are sending data to them over their API. They are using that for some unclear purposes, and but just the fact that you are sending data to them over the wire is, just by its nature, a potential violation of regulations completely independent of whether or not it's involved in AI. And so I think that that's also another interesting aspect to this, of the facts of it being AI is why people are using it, but there is maybe a little bit of a lack of generalized knowledge about what that even means to interact with that AI and some of the requirements around what those interaction patterns should look like. And I'm wondering what you're seeing as far as the general distribution of that knowledge and some of the ways that organizations are starting to come to grips with that and how that factors into their overall policy evaluation, policy creation.
Yeah. Well, because of that model, I mean, they obviously do offer their own version where you get an isolated version. They claim that they're not storing any of that information, et cetera, and et cetera. And then it comes down to a trust situation with the vendor and contracts and all that fun stuff. But what I am seeing is a lot of people who are more sensitive to their information are exploring either private, like Llama 2 instances, et cetera, where they host them on site, or private cloud kind of situations like using an Amazon Bedrock within your own secure private cloud instance, et cetera. So you do know what's happening with it and things like that. So we're seeing some preference towards that kind of model. But there's different consumers and different levels of those because they are foundational models. If I've got true PII information that has to go through this for some reason, again, you may want to consider, is the PII information even necessary to the task, to make sure you avoid that. But then you're probably going to want pretty tight control over where it's going, et cetera, because you don't want to end up disclosing somebody else's PII, or worse yet, even like healthcare protected information. I mean, that's a whole nother set of regulations that's out there now. You got HIPAA in place. You can't you got to be careful on those things. As nothing, as you said, to do with AI. It's good data hygiene to make sure you understand where any potentially sensitive or regulated data, et cetera, is going. And that's just something you got to do now. I think the allure of the capabilities of things like ChatGPT 4 and et cetera, and the newness of it is, tempting to, everyone wants to use it because it does help solve a whole bunch of problems. But how do you do that in such a way that it maintains the privacy of both the individuals that are contained within the request, but also private company information, et cetera. You don't want to send your financials out into wherever, that kind of thing. That can be problematic. So it's not a new problem, but I think it's an enhanced problem because of the features you can get out by sending all that information to one of these foundational models.
Another interesting wrinkle to the problem of governance and control over how these different technologies are being used is that the ease of use and ease of access makes it very favorable to sort of the shadow IT pattern of somebody is using these tools as a convenience, not necessarily in any sort of formalized process or any sort of directly integrated technology stack. And I imagine that that also poses some challenges as far as the policy enforcement piece of making sure that these systems aren't being used out of band from established and approved practices and means of technology integration. Maybe somebody's just using it on their laptop to try and solve a quick problem and they inherently leak some sensitive information. And I'm wondering how you're seeing people try to tackle that problem of the inherent kind of virality of these systems and their penchant for being used in a shadow IT manner.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to several IT professionals who are in like hospitals or these kinds of places where there is a lot of sensitive information, and they've had to take the steps of absolutely just blocking the domains. They basically just do not allow traffic to go to them because the risks are too high. So, that way it forces people to go through whatever interfaces they provide, which are more curated. Because, yeah, I mean, somebody can just hit Copilot in their Edge browser and cut and paste information. If you're a software developer, you cut some sensitive piece of code into there for an abbreviated, where did that go? What was logged? What, you don't really know. It's just so embedded in these things. And that's the dangers of vendor models and not understanding what they're doing in the back end and not having an approval process for them is, yeah, you don't really know what the terms and conditions. I mean, I doubt the average user is reading through the EULA with the 1,000 things that it says it's going to do, and that changes every time you get software update to understand what the ramifications could be to the business of that. And so you got to block at the network layer, but especially with today's remote work environment and all that kind of thing, I think it's an ongoing challenge, and a lot of that will come down to education.
You mentioned too that a lot of the basics of how to use these models in an appropriate manner is really just a matter of good data hygiene. And data governance as a practice has been around for quite some time. There are established methods, established protocols. It is a generally understood, if not uniformly deployed, set of
Yeah.
practices. And I'm wondering what you see as some of the different dimensions of technical controls that are present in the space of data governance, how those also can be applied in the application of generative AI systems.
Yeah, well, that's a part of a whole AI governance solution, or as we refer to it as ModelOps. It's kind of like what Gartner's using as a term to describe the space, and you have to take all of that into account. Like our solution, for example, we rely on that they have a data hygiene solution and have that in place. But what we do need to do is we tie references to the data to the usage of the model. So you have a use case, and then you have the implementation, and the implementation should have those references to the exact data sets that are going to be used and or were part of the training if that's appropriate, or part of the RAG implementation, if they're the reference docs. All of that needs to be kind of closed loop, if that makes sense. So you need to have the data governance in place so you understand and have things like GPDR support, et cetera, to remove data when requested. But that ties into now we need to track, okay, which models are using those data sets. So if there ever is an issue with that data set, or we want to make sure you understand that, oh, we found an issue with this, we need to do a review or anything, you need to have that back associated with the model instance and the model governance process. So rather than model governance replacing data governance, it actually works with data governance, and the two can work hand in hand and give you that closed loop solution.
In addition to the core data hygiene practices and the policies around the use and distribution of data and the access controls around that, what are some of the additional technical controls that are necessary and are being developed to assist in the policy enforcement around the foundation models specifically? I'm thinking in terms of things like context filters that make sure that certain pieces of data never actually get passed along in the API request, or token masking of some of that data, so that in the context of your application that is using the model, you use some sort of identifier as a replacement that is not at the actual PII, so that when you send it to the model, it uses that token as a placeholder, and then on the return trip you're able to replace it back with the original data. Just some of the ways that you're seeing people approach some of those technical controls.
Yeah, well, for years, people have used for doing machine learning training. There's solutions that actually generate unique tokens that can basically, for neural networks, can replace the actual PII data itself. Because as long as it has a consistent, uniqueness to it, then the neural network's not really gonna know the difference, because it doesn't know, Joe versus Mary. It just knows there's a Joe and a Mary. It doesn't have to know. You could change it to Yaj and what Iram. I don't know how to say Mary backwards, but basically you could do that, and the neural network, as long as that was done consistently and reproducibly, then the training is going to end up pretty much the same. So we've seen those techniques for years. Now, when we get to actual generative AI models, and the fact that they're often foundational models, and you have RAG architectures that can bring stuff in, et cetera, on that. Typically, what we do is, so we automate baseline testing and things like that of generative AI solutions. And one of the ways we do that, for instance, is like one of the tests you can run is PII detection. So you can use some jailbreaking prompts and things like that to automate that and attempt to get it to disclose PII, as well as do ongoing reviews of real answers that are out there, so you can detect that a PII were going to be disclosed. Obviously, things like guardrails and stuff can be put in place to help prevent that, but it's also nice to know that it was potentially going to disclose that information, or potentially did. So there's techniques to do that out there, but it's a lot getting back to the same ideas of like establishing baselines, et cetera. You can do it using natural language techniques. You can do it using basically cross LLM querying techniques, et cetera, so that you can understand what was submitted as the potential solution for the problem, but then continue to monitor that over time and see if you get affected drift from original baseline data to understand a little bit that the model might be doing something it's not supposed to be. So that's very important, and that's part of a model governance solution is both initial baselining and then ongoing monitoring of the model itself.
To your point about jailbreaking, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in this space as far as being able to manage the reliability of these applications for one, but also from a security perspective, is that you can have a set of test prompts where you give it some request, you get some response back, you eyeball it, you say, okay, that looks good. But when you actually put it in front of consumers and they're able to send whatever they want to the model, there are all kinds of different ways that they can maybe get around some of these static guardrails of, if somebody says bomb, then say, I'm sorry, I don't know how to respond to your request. But if they then change that to say explosive, then it's like, oh, sure, no problem. And just the mutability of language makes it very difficult to have any sort of strict and generalizable controls and guarantees around any filtering or security that you're trying to put around those models. And I'm wondering how that factors into the ways that people are thinking about the contexts in which they're even willing to employ generative AI, because of the fact that there is such a broad range of potential surface area for attack vectors.
Is has been said, and I like to say as well, is LLMs are fluent but not factual. They basically they know how to speak because of vector patterns and stuff. They don't understand what they're saying. So if you're never going to get a full restrictive way of if you allow open access to the foundational models and you can send any kind of prompt you want, et cetera. But that's not generally what we're seeing. You can control the kinds of prompts because you put applications in front of them ideally. You're again, I don't see as much concern with like if you go on to chat GPT and you get to say something offensive, who really cares at the end of the day? You're trying to trick it into doing something, and it's like, oh no, you got to say a dirty word. That's silly in my opinion because you're doing it. And you're creating that outcome. But when it gets to a business use case, though, again, I wouldn't expect open access to the foundational model. Instead, it would be going through some kind of an application. So you can take steps to avoid that. I mean, like in NVIDIA's NeMo, you can even control the flow of how they interact with it and avoid them from doing very specific flows and things like that. Whereas guardrails are more of a pre-filter, post-filter kind of things for responses, et cetera, as well. So there are techniques to handle that, but a lot can be done by controlling how they're interacting with it. I don't know. I would put just a raw allow prompts to come in from a customer for a chatbot. It's going to be controlled. I'll remove any kind of prompting from it. When you're doing a real application and you have a business purpose, that just gets a little bit easier. And I think that's what we'll see more and more. The early failures have been when somebody just slaps up a model with no review, and like the famous car dealership where they got them to sell them a car for $1. The reality is, short of making the business look foolish, it really didn't have any impact. They're not going to sell. It's not legally binding. They're not going to sell the car for $1 or whatever. But it shows the danger of running too quick and not having things in place because clearly nobody really reviewed this or tried it out. We just slapped one up there real quick and gave free access. I think you'll see as people get more hygiene around this, they will have more purpose-oriented interfaces where it's going to be careful. The big danger is hallucinations, because that's even harder to detect. Because it's like if it just makes something up as an answer, it gets very challenging to detect that. And that's more one, I think, the bigger things is just telling people wrong information.
To the point too about the hallucinations as well as the constraints around what types of inputs you're allowing to the models. I'm wondering what you're seeing as far as how people are maybe using structured inputs and structured outputs to constrain the overall potential state space to reduce some of those error conditions and reduce some of those potentialities for making stuff up, and just some of the application architectures that have been useful to manage the randomness of these models and bring it into a fairly well known operating environment, and making sure that it's not just going to go off the rails and just start spewing completely incorrect information.
Well, the inputs and output, well, the outputs are the in fact, the non-factual information, but the inputs don't control that as much because you can give it a perfectly valid input and it will just make stuff up sometimes. Because again, it's fluent, not factual. So it sounds very convincing when it tells you that, and I think that's the biggest challenge with the LLMs versus like a search engine leading you to a site that has incorrect information. The model talks to you like a very smart person. It sounds very fluent. So it's pretty convincing. So a lot of people will just take what it says as fact. Now, controlling the inputs, what we see is, you want to make sure they're not trying to like change system prompts and things like that. And we're definitely seeing that. And a lot of that comes down to, as I said, things like using NVIDIA's Nemo or Guardrails AI at these points, or even some homegrown solutions, where you're looking at things where they're using LangChain and doing their own things through sequential chains in there and that kind of things to make sure those kinds of things are scrubbed. I think it's still an immature space and there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to provide better overall solutions for stopping these kinds of clearly jailbreaking techniques and attacks. And you do see that now more and more with like ChatGPT 4 when they do identify something. For instance, you have to be careful of not playing with these techniques too much because you get nasty grams from them saying, stop doing that, we're going to suspend your account. So even when I'm trying to do demos of technology to show what is possible, not malicious, it catches that as well. So you will see more and more of that come on as line as well as I think. The actual output hallucinations, these models are uninterpretable. We don't know how exactly it arrives at that conclusion. People are trying to do some of that through like node clustering visualizations and self-explanation and other techniques like these, but they're still very immature. And so there's other things you have to do. For instance, like in a RAG solution, one of the things we offer within our package is the ability to compare the response against the reference source documents and making sure the cosine similarity is high between the two. And, from that, you would expect then, if assuming the data you fed in, garbage in, garbage out, assuming the data you fed in your RAG reference documents is good, and the output matches that fairly closely, it's probably not too far of a hallucination. If anything, it's probably more interpretable that way. So there are some things you can do in the output side too to help detect these in the typical usage scenario which we're seeing, which is the RAG architecture.
Another aspect of these models that is still, I think, in the exploration and development phase, it hasn't been as widely adopted as the RAG pattern, is the use of them for multi-turn conversations, where it has to maintain conversational context over the course of the interaction. And my understanding is that increases the potentiality for hallucination because it has to try and maintain more and more information, and eventually it just kind of loses its brains and starts coming up with stuff. And I'm wondering how you're seeing organizations weigh the potential benefits of the user experience around those multi-turn conversations against the potential risks and the system and architectural complexity of being able to manage that from a implementation perspective.
Yeah, well, and you also forgot one other big one with those is cost. The more tokens you load into there and the more tokens you're processing, the more your cost goes up as well. So all of those have impacts. What I'm seeing initially is, especially we deal mostly with Fortune 500 customers, so they're a little more cautious in their adaptation of bringing these technologies in. But what we're seeing at first being used is human in the middle. So basically, like I'm a support agent for a call center or something like that. I will have an internal app where I can ask it these questions, et cetera, and that kind of things, which gets me the answers quicker so they don't need to know everything. But then the human will actually converse with the outside person, whether it be live on audio or through their chat system, et cetera, and that kind of things. And that does give you that gating item of, your internal employee is not trying to jailbreak your own technique. That doesn't make sense, but it does help them get the benefits of quicker access to the customer's answers. So you have kind of human in the middle, and then they converse directly with the human. And if they see something really bad come up, they're going to be able to see that, mark it, give it a thumbs down so it can go back to the team, the data scientists to actually potentially address. And, then you've kind of got a human gateway. Otherwise, the other areas I'm seeing, as I said, like NVIDIA's NeMo is like simple guardrails are kind of just a post filter. NVIDIA NeMo actually controls flow at any point. It's fairly complex to use as a disadvantage. It's not real straightforward and requires a bunch of work and testing and development and et cetera and that kind of things. But it's promising if these could be made simpler, because then you can prevent flows where it's clearly going off the rails, so to speak. No pun intended there. But I think you'll see more and more of that kind of control of the conversation and techniques to evolve there. But right now, what I'm seeing first pass is a lot of internal apps where, it's not going out to the customer and that kind of things until you get to something as big as an Amazon where they have the resources to make sure they can clamp down on the automated chatbots. But they've been doing that for years.
And to that point of internal versus external tool and application use, how are you seeing organizations manage that risk calculus and the cost benefit analysis of whether they actually want to expose an AI driven capability to their end users versus the amount of engineering effort and organizational oversight that's required?
Well, I think that's where everyone's mostly just sticking their toe in the water right now, to be honest. And that's where we're trying to provide the governance solutions to enable that process so you can do that. And that's where, as I said, it starts with a use case. And in a proper AI governance solution, you assign business risk just to that use case before you even pick the technology. So whether it's a traditional machine learning model, an Excel spreadsheet, Python code, generative AI, there's a risk to doing something. So you need to analyze that and have that process in place. A lot of places don't. And that's a problem because, it's like, again, if it's a low risk, low business risk use case, you can probably go out on a limb a little bit more and try newer technologies. If it's like running your automated trading or something, you could lose $1 billion overnight. It's probably going to be very high risk to the business, and you're going to be a lot more cautious about what it does. But risk assessments are not just about the dollars; they can also be about the liability. For instance, if it was biased in how it treated customers on that kind of thing. So, for instance, they're getting a lot better, but early on we developed some tests by basically looking at protected classes and just asking it the same questions, but tweaking the persona only of the protected class. And early on, I would see very different answers versus, like, for a simple example of male versus female. You only change the attribute of a complex persona description, and I get things that are clearly biased female versus male, based on stereotypes because that's how they're trained. And that's concerning. That's a risk to the business as well. You don't want to be treating your customers differently based on those. So the customers are really just starting to look at this. They're dipping their toes in the waters. A safer path right now is to do internally focused, have that human in the middle. And at the larger companies, that's what we're seeing. But, they're just really getting going on the Gen AI journey. AI, however, it's been ML. Yeah, AI has been around for a long time in these companies, and they have better understanding of how to mitigate that risk because some models are inherently interpretable, or you can do things like Shapley and Lime to understand why they're making decisions, and you can control the risks better. So that's why there's huge adoption of that. Generative AI is just getting going. And frankly, I think they're seeing how it plays out. We had one customer do an internal kind of support chat thing, and they're seeing really good results with it. So, that's giving them the confidence to go forward. And I think that's what we'll see is it's a learning journey at this point.
Another interesting aspect of this is that in the generative AI space, most of the attention has been around the natural language models of text in, text out, but there has been an increasing investment in multimodality or other modalities as well, rather than just pure language or pure text. And I'm wondering how you are seeing the capabilities of other modalities impact the potentiality for risk or maybe harm to the brand or even just risk in terms of a cost perspective.
Well, I think the risk doesn't change a lot between those. How you detect it is a little harder. So, for instance, classifying an image as offensive is a heck of a lot harder than classifying a word as offensive because there's well-known measures of things like toxicity, gibberish detection, offensive language detection, hate detection, etc. There are well-known algorithms that do that fairly well. So I think with the text, it's a little bit easier to pick that up. What makes an image offensive would change from culture to culture even. You have certain religious figures, etc. You can't have appear in an image, for instance, an example. How do you detect that and understand what that means? Never mind, just inappropriate, etc. Images are a whole new beast that way, and detecting it is hard. I don't think it's any different fundamentally in that, you can make an offensive audio clip, you can make an offensive image or offensive language. They have the same risk on that kind of things, but detecting them is what is harder. So how do I filter, for instance, an inappropriate image and do it in a culturally sensitive manner that actually works across all kinds of cultures? One thing that's offensive to somebody is clearly not offensive to the other. I think speech is a little more understood that way, and that's why it's easier to detect. But that, as you start to do that, now I don't see a whole lot of customers doing like end user, so like they're their customers giving them image generation capability. I mean that's kind of a like using Dolly 3 or something like that. It's done by people, they get the results. If they did find something offensive, it's going to be back against the foundational model, and they're doing them and they're reviewing them and seeing them again before they go out. I haven't seen a whole lot of like true large companies doing anything that actually goes right to their customers that generates that kind of thing. So it's early on that. Same thing with audio. I'm not seeing a whole lot of that, but audio is a little easier because at least you can do text to speech. Obviously, there could be offensive background sounds or other things in there that could pop up, but I think that's more of an edge case. So the modality doesn't so much affect what it could do, but more how you prevent it.
And in the overall technical ecosystem of the current generative AI landscape, what do you see as the areas that are in greatest need of investment to ease that burden of risk and validation of the models and make it easier for organizations to bring the overall risk profile into a space that they are comfortable with actually doing that exploration and deployment?
Well, a lot of it comes down to trust in the model at that point. How much do you trust it? And that's why we developed our company. ModelOp develops a governance solution. So going through all the steps, going through all the reviews, understanding the data that's there, et cetera, making sure you follow that process and then do the proper ongoing monitoring. Models should be expired at some point. There's all kinds of things that need to occur. That helps a lot in developing the trust in that the model is appropriate for its business use case. And that will help move things forward. And that tooling that we've developed really helps with that, but it's getting the individual companies to recognize they must do this now. Think of it as like the early days in coding, where I loved it at the time. Is you build it on your desktop, throw it out in production, straight from there, no review, no reproducibility, that kind of things. Eventually, DevOps came along. And at first there was resistance to using it because it's more steps you got to do, and developers are busy, they don't want to do this. But over time, when it stopped you from getting calls at 2 a.m. because your system's down, you you grew to appreciate having this formalized process for doing that. I think that's what we're seeing now. We're in the early stages of model governance for the purpose of providing these same kind of safeguards, et cetera, and reproducibility and all of those things that come with it. And so, there's resistance from data scientists, et cetera, to want to do it because there's more stuff you got to do, and it just seems like overhead. But it pays back for itself in the long run. And additionally, I think that, there needs to be more tools around. I don't think you ever get true explainability, but what kinds of steps can we continue to provide that helps make us understand why these things are coming to the decisions they're coming to, so we can do more effective monitoring. We've developed some of our own tests that are more business use case oriented in testing it against its intended use. And I think you'll see a lot more there because we've seen a bunch in the foundational models. That's great. Almost nobody's training their models. Most people aren't retraining or doing reinforcement learning. Really expensive. They're doing RAG architectures and things like that where it's well known. So what kinds of tests can be developed to make sure that they're actually performing against their use case? And I think we'll get more and more robust methodologies to do that as well. Because if you don't fully have to understand what exactly the model is doing unless you're in the highest regulated industries, but it is nice to know that it's performing well against its intended use. And that, again, builds trust.
And in your experience of working in this space of model governance, AI regulations, helping organizations come to grips with what is possible for managing that risk and helping them to understand what are appropriate policies and technical controls around that. I'm wondering, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen companies address that challenge of AI governance?
Well, I think the biggest thing I've seen is people underestimate what it takes. We see a lot of DIY solutions within companies, and think of it as like, oh, I'm going to go build my own Jenkins. I'm going to build my own, Sonar. I'm going to go build my. It compounds. The amount you actually have to do, and as rapidly as these regulations are coming out, and worse yet, because we don't, like in the U.S., we don't have kind of a federal standard. There's a lot of states doing their individual things. It just makes it more and more complex. Of like, what do I have to exactly do? And you read regulations. I have to, unfortunately. I don't ever suggest you do. They're not like software documentation. They are really obscure. So you also have to find leaders in the industry to kind of follow along and say, hey, yeah, we're all in this together, and this is our understanding of what this really means. So that vagueness within the regulations as well. And so a lot of companies are just overwhelmed and frankly don't know what to do. And sometimes, though, I think human nature sometimes is it's safer to do nothing. But even though it's really not, it feels that way. So, this is a space we see is rapidly emerging, and it's going to be you got to get going now on it and do things now, because it's going to be a lot harder later, and there's just going to be more and more regulations. And, it's the do nothing or try to build it yourself is usually not the best option in the world. And that's what I keep seeing again and again, is this underestimation of the problem.
And in your own experience of building this governance platform, helping organizations understand their risk profiles and just trying to keep track of the overall AI industry as it continues to evolve at such a rapid pace, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Well, I've just learned how quick things can shift. I mean, I guess it's not so much a surprise as I've been developing software for like 40 years. So I've seen big inflections. I mean, think of like when the internet and World Wide Web really took off. I mean, things were changing so rapidly, and tons of investment in random directions and et cetera, and waiting for that needle to settle down a little as to exactly what is the direction. So the biggest challenge I've seen is the continued ongoing evolution of what exactly it means to govern models in general. So, we've been talking a lot about AI, but, we've started this 5, 6 years ago. We're doing traditional machine learning models and et cetera. But now the whole ball of wax of what it means to govern an AI model is so up in the air, and we're all trying to figure it out and what makes sense. You don't want to stifle innovation, but you do want to provide protection for consumers against discrimination from or misinformation or any of this kind of stuff when it's directly affecting their lives. And that's what we're seeing, is this rapid evolution of the large language models and how they sound so smart yet can't do basic math. And people are concerned that they're going to take over the world, et cetera, and all these things, and all this noise, plowing through that and figuring out the right things to do has been it's any of these hype cycles. It's kind of a big deal to keep up with, and try to see through the fog and where it goes. And just the steepness of this curve over the last year has been pretty amazing, frankly.
As you continue to keep tabs on the space and try to come to grips with what are the risks, what are the capabilities, what are the appropriate levels of control and appetite for risk, what are some of the technical or social or organizational trends of AI risk and governance that you're monitoring?
Well, I mean, I kind of read a lot. I mean, we do a lot, especially because we're dealing with larger customers around really understanding these emerging regulations. Because like the Act specifically is going to require certain industries and certain spaces to actually submit reports to them in order to be able to operate. So, that's a challenge. How do you make sure these reports get in and updated and things like that? That's one of the problems we've already solved. But like what we're seeing, especially organizationally, is, there's a huge appetite in the individual lower level business units to want to consume this stuff. I mean, it's cool, it's new, you want to learn about it, it's got capabilities that are really powerful. And then, you have kind of the higher levels who understand that business risk, and how do you bridge that gap to bring together, not stifling the innovation, but still managing that risk. And that's where you have to have process. You have to open communication between all these different levels of larger organizations. And that's why you have to have what we refer to as a model lifecycle that manages that process and makes things happen and opens up that communication so you can have these kinds of discussions. And you do have the metrics and the factors and all the information and metadata, who's using it and when for what, so you can make an intelligent decision. So it's really going to have to break down some barriers between the things that might otherwise be organizationally separated, so that you can work together to achieve the benefits of what these provide. Because clearly, I mean, we've seen use cases, and they're using it like in support call centers, et cetera, and they're seeing massive improvements in outcomes. So that's very good for the business. But how do I both embrace this and move it forward in my organization and avoid some of these big scary things that are out there, which a lot of times don't materialize and or get hyped up. But like there's the things where I think it was McDonald's that put out their AI stuff in there, and somebody went up to a kiosk and ended up with 260 orders of chicken McNuggets and couldn't cancel the order and things like that. Bad deployments cost, both image wise and trust wise and et cetera. So that's really what we're seeing is the organization's gonna have to come together and work how to see the benefit from these, but also mitigating that risk.
In terms of the current level of opacity and the centralization of the kind of creation and maintenance and updates of these models, as well as just the overall operational cost of training them initially, but also using them for inference, I'm wondering how you see that impacting the future trajectory of the model architectures, investment in their developments and capabilities, and just some of the things that you either maybe anticipate based on your own understanding of it, or maybe just wishful thinking that you would like to see it go towards.
Yeah, well, that's the operational cost is a big issue. It will consume a lot of computing resources, and that's what again everyone's still trying to figure this out. I mean, people are still trying to figure out cloud costs in general to their business. It's getting a lot more predictable, but even then, how do you rein that in and don't get a big surprise bill? So I think we're seeing a lot of organizations examining multiple paths, whether it be a vendor-hosted solution like ChatGPT-4 or a Llama 2 instance they run locally, and then if you're running it locally on your own hardware, for instance, you have sunk costs and that's it. But then does it perform well enough for that? Or do I use a hosted solution like Amazon's Bedrock and accept the costs that could come with that? And again, don't have a lot of fully deployed solutions out there yet. So a lot of that is still being learned because we've seen clients where they do the hosted, but they do have some controls around it. And then we see others who buy tons of NVIDIA GPUs at great upfront cost, but now their cost is fixed and they're just ramping up efforts. So was that enough investment? They don't know yet. So I think especially when we come to cost, it's not well understood. But we are seeing the interesting side is both small language models, which you can actually run on much more modest hardware but perform pretty darn good, as well as things like GPT-4o, which is much less cost per token and may perform adequately for your tasks. So I think we're going to see a little bit of how do we balance the costs versus what comes out. And the really interesting thing is I'm seeing is some of the really newer ultra large language models are not really performing better than like the counterparts. So we may be hitting a point where additional training, et cetera, is not necessarily going to be worth it for the cost of the difference in models, especially when the other ones are good enough. So I think we're going to see a lot around that, and never mind the small language models. I don't know if you've played with them. You can run some of those on your cell phone, and they actually perform okay. So I think it's going to get interesting. We're going to see those costs potentially come down.
Are there any other aspects of this overall space of AI model governance, the policy considerations, the regulatory environment, the technical capabilities that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, well, the biggest one is just realizing that. I mean, I keep I feel like the person caught in the middle sometime, because there's the people who want no governance and regulation who don't want to stifle innovation in any way, shape, or form. And for the raw foundational models, I definitely feel that's okay, because caveat emptor, you're using them. It's your responsibility to assess the risk, and that's why you need model governance. But on the other hand, it makes me nervous to not have any regulation when it is making decisions that affect people's lives directly. So it's making a healthcare decision. I mean, I think it was Nevada's developing one to actually decide whether you get unemployment insurance or not. These are big decisions that really hurt people if they're done wrong or done in an uninterpretable, non-understandable way, and don't have some kind of human review or something in the process to make this happen. So when you think of model governance, it often comes off in the negative light, whereas it's like, yeah, if we're talking over-regulating the development of foundational models, afraid they're going to take over the world, that is not the kind of governance I think is important. When it comes down to the business use case and it affects real people's lives, whether you get a job, whether you get covered under healthcare insurance or not, whether you get unemployment insurance or not, whether it detects your cancer cells or not, these are things that are really important. And from that aspect, that's where I believe governance makes sense. We do need some oversight and holding people accountable for this, because right now you submit a resume to a company. I know a lot of people are looking for jobs out there, and it just disappears. You don't, a lot of times these AI models just throwing the resume out and no human ever even saw it. I don't think that's a great situation for us to be in, especially if there was any discriminatory practice built into that model that people are unaware of. I don't think people are doing this purposely. It creeps in from the training data, et cetera. So we just need to be cautious about that. And that's where we do want peer review and processes within your organization, so that not only are you getting a great outcome as a business, but your customers are getting great outcomes as a customer as well. And we're doing it in a moral and just way.
Absolutely. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being some of the biggest gaps in tooling, technology, or human training that's available for AI systems today.
Yeah, from my standpoint, I mean, obviously we think model governance is a big one, and that's why we're building it. There's very, very few companies in our space developing these solutions that actually scale and can handle Fortune 500 kind of situations and do it the right way. So, obviously we identified that as a huge gap, and that's one of the things we're building it just because of that, that needs to be out there. I also feel I already mentioned this early, but anything we can do around applicability to business use case and detecting performance, how do we do that with these AI generative AI models, because we need to understand how well they are performing against tasks, and any techniques we can develop to do that as well. We're seeing that out in the space. I also feel like, specifically around the flow control, is that like NVIDIA NeMo is great in some ways, very complex to use, very difficult to build. I think great tooling that would sit on top of that would make it more visual in nature of how you could control that and test it and debug it and et cetera. There's stuff being developed there. I think that's a great space where there could be absolutely more tooling, because you need two levels. You need the governance up front to make sure you're doing the things right, but then you need the real-time defense as well, which isn't really governance. It's just, making sure that it's not going off the rails, so to speak, in place, and making that simpler, easier to use, more understandable, more traceable, et cetera, is an area that is largely lacking on that kind of thing. I think all the investment right now is going into just train these models to make them perform better on one or more scores. That's not useful, but probably now we need to start industrializing these models, how can I make them more usable for developing the business case? We saw a little bit of that with like the automated chat GPTs and copilots and things like that. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space to make them more consumable to a business cause and use case.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your thoughts and experience of working in this space of model governance. And I appreciate the work that you and the rest of your team are doing at ModelOp to make that a more consumable and manageable process for some of these organizations. It's definitely very important to continue that work. So I appreciate you helping to push us all forward in that direction. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it and enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out our other shows. The Data Engineering Podcast, which covers the latest in modern data management, and Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. You can visit the site at themachinelearningpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at themachinelearningpodcast.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.